so no problem. I mean, there is a reason why I didn't mind taking the time off from my presentation, because this is very preliminary work. I don't think it will take me the 40 minutes. So that's another good news for you, because you will be able to go faster to your lunch.
Don't say that, always go over. Go ahead.
Okay, so thanks for having me here. This is work that I started with a student of mine, Samit, that is now actually in McGill, but couldn't come to the presentation because he's very busy with classes and stuff. So the title is a little bit different from what you have in the schedule, because we were very reluctant. I am still very reluctant in telling that we are talking about quality, but it has some correlation. So just don't get too hung up on the title and just take it for what it is. It's a very descriptive work at this point. So the main motivation for this paper is the common observation that immigrant women have significantly worse labor market outcomes that domestic-born women do. So these gaps have been improving over the years, for sure, and we have learned about this a lot because there was a lot of research after the pandemic to try to look at these gaps and how the pandemic had affected them. And there has been an improvement, for sure. And here I show you employment rates for women on that side, whatever that side is, in red. And you can see how there is a general increase in employment rates for women, even the Canadian-born, which are at the top, but also for all other groups of immigrants. And you can also see that the gaps are relatively large, particularly for those who just arrived within the last 5 years, which are at the bottom. And then as you spend time in Canada, you kind of recover. But there is still substantial gaps that exist up at the top where, so they are where you have been in the country for over 10 years. So at the other side, you have that this is not the case for men. So typically, it's only recently arrived men that have lower employment rates, but they are mostly gone after a few years, that is 5 years in the country, and we have seen there that in later years, there is not even that. I mean, if anything, immigrant men have higher employment rates than Canadian-born. And the same is true for wages. So here you can see the difference. Again, you can see a general increase in the wages, both of the Canadian-born and the immigrants. Large gaps for recently arrived immigrants in the pale pink, and much lower gaps when immigrants have been more than 10 years in the country. But these gaps still exist, and they have not improved as much. So you can see there for 2021. For 2021, the gap between settled immigrants and the Canadian-born is larger than it used to be. And again, you can see that that is definitely not the case for men, because the gaps there. I mean, there is no gap in the sense of a negative gap. So the recovery and the catching up is much stronger for men than for women, for sure. So that's it. So.
Was that from non-visible minority?
Yeah, because I mean, this is not from my data. I don't have information about visible minority in my data, so that I borrow from a table in Statistics Canada, and they had it separately for visible minority and non-visible minority. This was for non-visible minority. The non-visible minority. The gaps for visible minority are way larger. I just didn't want to mix the visible minority in with the immigration. And this is a flaw of the paper in general. So the second point or motivation for this paper was that we know very little about the jobs that immigrants do in general. I mean, beyond employment and wages and participation rates, we know very little. So the reason, I mean, there is a reason for that, and because when you start talking about these other attributes and coming to the quality issue, quality is very complex, it's very multidimensional, and it's very, very difficult to measure, to summarize, or to talk about in any kind of objective way. So, but we were curious. So what we know that there is a lot of interest in job quality as such, that, I mean, and you can find special issues of very well respected journals that devote one of their series for the topic of job quality. I cited 2 here. So social scientists are always very interested in this, political policymakers as well. And so we thought that it's worth at least trying to get into it imperfectly. So we are going to discuss this literature only in the context of immigration rather than more generally, because there is a large literature on job quality, job satisfaction, etc. So we found first, or maybe a prior, I'm not sure it's the first, but the first reference we found to the topic of job quality in the context of immigration, it was used to explain the complementarity of immigrant jobs. So Hammermes and also in these papers actually try to get at why immigrants actually are complementary rather than substitutes in labor with the domestic born, and they consider that it's the differences in terms of how they consider non-pecuniary aspects of the job, what they are broadly calling job quality, that makes up for this difference. So either because they have different preferences over these non-pecuniary elements because of the cultural preferences, or because they have different budget constraints that make them value them differently. So the truth is that they choose different types of jobs, and that is what makes them complementary to domestic labor. So in terms of how to measure the issue of job quality, the European Union has actually very good study on this, where they study what makes a good job in terms of different things, and they come up with this sense or this idea that there are issues related to pay, compensation, benefits, including health benefits, but also others, flexibility, how well your job allows you to adapt to other demands in life, and there is a 4th one I just blanked out on. But this, so they kind of do a very good job laying down this taxonomy of what makes a good job, and actually there are some papers that have used that same taxonomy to actually look at these characteristics, the difference in these characteristics between the the domestic and the immigrant workers. Okay, so these are 2 of them. These studies are based on the European Union, and they look at differences across different countries. So they actually highlight a lot the impact of institutional framework in creating these differences in job quality. So in Canada, the recent studies on this one by Chen and Mehdi, who uses actually the same type of frame from the European Union and measures all these characteristics using the GSS, and shows that women tend to be in lower quality jobs than men. It's a more broader. They don't discuss immigrants a lot in this study. And a very recent one, Lam and Banerjee, so that also look and report that immigrants actually have lower quality jobs than, in this case, the Canadian born. Okay, so these are the most recent Canadian studies. And again, the objective measures of this that were outlined in the European framework are things like things that have to do with the schedules, whether the job is full-time or part-time, whether you have a permanent contract, whether the job is unionized. That's the sort of thing that we can find generally in labor force survey type of data. So what we wanted to do here was to see, well, maybe we can look at something else. So there is a long tradition in labor to use these job tasks measures, mostly from the ONET database, that were pioneered by authors who used them to actually document the labor polarization between routine and non-routine employment because of technological change, and many others have used it in that line. Information about job tasks has also been used to document the risks of automation in recent Canadian papers, and this is where we got the idea. So, I mean, not only in Canadian papers, of course, but recently for the case of Canada. And in general, this has been used by other people in the immigration literature to try to see whether there are some characteristics or some tasks that you use in jobs that immigrants are more attracted to than Canadians, or they ended up in those jobs to a larger extent than Canadians or domestic workers do. So I have a few examples there. I don't know if it's, but they all compute these indexes of characteristics of the job, mostly around the issue of whether the job has a large share of manual tasks, whether the job has a large share of language or communication-based tasks, because those are the dimensions along which they think that an immigrant arriving into a country may be pulled into those type of jobs because difficulties with the language or difficulties with other barriers in terms of employment. So from these papers, the ones that are more similar to what I'm going to do today are those the previous papers of mine with Alicia Tsera and others that are looking at what is the difference between the amount of tasks that you perform that are quantitative versus manual or versus language related, because those are the dimensions along which we think immigrants are more likely to separate themselves, and in particular for the case of Canada, because immigrants are often selected on their education, we thought that an educated immigrant will have a much easier job going for highly quantitative type of tasks that may require less communication rather than highly so jobs that require a lot of communication skills. So again, what we want to do is to build into this literature and use job tasks that are strongly associated with resilience to automation. Okay, so that's what we see as the contribution of the paper. Again, in very early stages yet. So we are going to look at this resilience to innovation using characteristics that have been highlighted. We are not going to pick different characteristics. We are going to go with what the literature of automation has pointed out as characteristics with different degrees of chances or risks of automation. We are going to use these characteristics disaggregated rather than trying to pull them into an index, because there is some information that is missing when you do that. And finally, a very more interesting piece of this is that we are going to explore this the role, or not the role, sorry, the position of Canadian immigrant women relative to Canadian-born women along this dimension, because it's mostly an unexplored intersectionality. And again, we are going to use standard human capital theory applied to immigration, while recognizing that there will be other factors that we are not going to get to. Let me highlight just a few differences in labor market outcomes that are specific for women. I mean, we all know there have been a lot of studies looking at what can be driving the differences between domestic and immigrant men in the labor market, but these are characteristics that are more specific to women. So the shifts in the common source countries from Europe to Asia and the Middle East that has been pointed out here have a particular effect for women, because by making credential recognition harder, they also affect jobs that in which women are highly represented, such as healthcare and education. So at the same time, the access to reskilling that is traditionally more difficult for women and mothers who have been out of the labor force, generally for everybody, is also more difficult for immigrant women because of cultural norms that regard the gender roles. So it's much harder for immigrant women in general to take time for this retraining or reskilling when they are burdened with most of the childcare and other domestic responsibilities. There is also the issue of tight migration, so women are generally not leading the migration choice, and in that sense they are less prepared to succeed in the labor market, and there is discrimination as well. So again, what we're going to focus on these measures of job quality. We are going to regard our paper, and I think Gabriel knows this. We are looking at a bunch of different things, but here I am going only to talk about high levels of non-routine tasks as a signal for good quality jobs in regards to this idea of these jobs are less resilient to, more resilient to automation. Okay, and in general, we think that an immigrant who has less local human capital will have lower levels of these good attributes that will maybe increase over time relative to the native born. And again, a very descriptive paper, so just a simple traditional OLS regression on wages or labor, not wages in this case, it's the traditional wage regression, but we are going to use these job tasks measures here as our dependent variable. And our main variable of interest is going to be the beta coefficients that is going to look at how immigrants are in regard to the native born with different time since migration. So we control for a bunch of things here. Maybe I should have talked about the data first. Well, it's the next slide. So we control for. This only happens to me. Sorry. And it's one of those calls to change your phone line or something. Sorry about that. So that's going to be our main point of interest, and we control for traditional things like age, square, education and presence of children, the prime age male unemployment rate in the economic region, so that we are sure to get some idea of business cycles or institutional features of the employment system, etc. So data comes partly from the LFS, where we are going to get all the demographic characteristics, all the job attributes that have to do with schedules, contracts, etc., and also information for the national occupation classification, which is key to link the data from the ONET database. So from the ONET, we are going to get information about these non-routine cognitive, analytical and interpersonal skills that have been pointed out as, being characteristics of jobs that are going to be difficult to automate. So these are analyzing data or information, thinking creatively, interpreting the meaning of information for others, and autonomy, which is actually a question of how much agency the worker has in setting their own goals, their own schedules, and their own working methodology in a scale of from 1 to 5. Okay, these are the list of all the other characteristics that we look at, but this is going to be our main focus. But we look at a bunch of 16 tasks. So this is the first result. So what this is doing is for this hardly or very difficult to automate type of task, we want to see how much the Canadian-born differ from the immigrants in terms of the amount of these tasks they do in their jobs. Okay, so for two people holding the same job, in general, what we can see is that, for instance, immigrants here, when they arrive in the country, their jobs have 0.3 less of these tasks, the interpersonal skills tasks, than the native born who are up there. Okay, so and as we can see, the gaps are relatively large. They increase quickly, though, which is probably relatively good, as I think. And they are very similar for all these three tasks that are going to measure analyzing data, interpersonal activities, or even creative thinking. It's a little bit different for the autonomy task that it shows very similar or much closer gaps, and but they, at the end of the day, they kind of remain relatively different from those even after a long period in the country. So for comparison, we wanted to see, well, what happens with the routine cognitive tasks. So these are tasks that initially may have been thought also are not going to be easy to automate, but in general, in view of the AI, they are probably going to be easier to automate in a few years. So this is tasks like being exact or doing repeated tasks, repeated cognitive tasks mostly. So to give you an idea, these are tasks that are ranked very high in service support, clerical, kind of medium level clerical occupations in general. And here we can see that for once, at least, the gaps are smaller, and they close after a year, some years from migration as well. So, I mean, the obvious point, as I said, this was part of my motivation for the paper, since Canada has a large fraction of university-educated women. Is this any different for these women? And we see that it is. I mean, it's not different in terms of the type of gaps that we see initially. They are pretty much the same, but we see a relatively faster kind of progression, but still, I mean, there is these gaps here that never close. There are way more difference for the routine cognitive tasks, because those actually now there are no gaps, they are positive. The immigrant women actually perform more of these tasks than the native born, and this is something increasing. And with the being exact task is same story. Closer gaps at arrival that close or go up after that. And I am not sure this is very important. Maybe I will skip this and I can come back to that if I have time. So again, both routine and non-routine cognitive tasks trend as expected, that as we thought it was going to be for good quality jobs, and also as we expected, they increase with time in the country. So surprisingly, education does not affect these gaps, at least not in routine tasks, nor does they bring them significantly close to zero after some time of settlement in the country. The education effect we can observe mostly in the gaps in routine tasks. And there we see smaller gaps and gaps that closer gradually over time. And I wanted to show you again, because that is the whole point, how different this is from men. So these are the gaps from men. I kept the same scale so that you can see how it is pretty much the same story that we saw with employment and wages. So relatively lower gaps that close much closer much earlier, or at least become closer much earlier, and there is still the same amount of gap that doesn't close, but then again those are smaller here, and there is pretty much no difference for routine cognitive tasks. And for the physical tasks, again, so that you get a sense of how different it is for the bad qualities of a job. So these are both I put it here only for university men and women. Surprising the significantly larger amount of these tasks that these workers perform relative to the Canadian born, but these are things that diminish over time. In particular, they tend to be relatively close after 16 to 20 years in the country. Not completely close, but relatively much closer. So what that is the result mainly is that with time in the country, immigrant women increase the level of cognitive tasks, both the routine and the non-routine ones, but there is a clear bias in terms of this happens mostly through for educated women and because of the routine cognitive tasks, which again are the ones that we suspect are going to be more prone to automation in the near future. So for instance, in Canada, there is this paper by Frank et al., and I'm sorry I forget the names of everybody even though I know them. So they report a 10% decline in employment shares for sales, clerical, and administrative support occupations, which are ones of the occupations that use a lot of routine cognitive tasks. And this was just between 2011 and 2018. So I suspect that this is already much larger than it was in even 5 more years. So to kind of close it up, we were just wondering, and again because I mean I've been talking about these differences in units of the task that run from 1 to 5, and I know that is really hard to picture. So what we did here is try to put a dollar value on those skills, and so to give you an idea, closing the gap in, for instance, analyzing data at the initial, when the immigrant arrives, will increase the salary or the wage of immigrant women by $2. And even at the end, in the 16 to 20 years since migration, closing the gap in analyzing data will increase the wage by 80 cents. Okay, and as you can see, I mean, I highlighted those because they are the largest, but you can see that this is a relatively similar story, at least, for the other characteristics as well. So finally, although the labor force survey doesn't give you any information about, or it makes it very difficult to look at mechanisms for this, we draw from the racialized newcomer women survey. It's a survey of recently arrived Canadian immigrants to Canada, women, educated women actually. They have to have post-secondary education, where they are asked about their experiences settling down in Canada. And so that we could at least know where would we be looking for in order to see barriers. And I mean, without exception, I mean, it was pretty surprising how a lot of it has to do with recognition of either education, but mostly experience. So 80% of those women surveyed there said that their problems finding a job or the right type of job, the job that matches their qualifications, lacks because they don't, their experience outside is not recognized. So 1/3 of these women also reported that family responsibilities are a huge problem when they have to go out looking for jobs or taking training courses or things like that. So these were seen as the main barriers. So less women report discrimination as a reason, but it's a substantial amount nevertheless. So you see? So I give you back full 10 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting reading this paper. I'll give a small caveat that my main research is not in immigration or Canadian data, so most of my comments will be more broad, but I think I can still hopefully say some things. So first, I'll give a brief summary of the paper. The presentation was great, so I'll try to keep it very brief. But essentially, reading this paper, I took away the main research question being, how do job attributes differ between immigrants and Canadian-born women? And specifically focusing on the main outcomes we often thinking about, employment, wages, resilience, but also really these kind of attributes, tasks of the jobs, so related to the resilience, as I said, which is maybe not as common. And then also what was important is that not just looking at the differences at a certain point, but how these differences change over successive immigrant cohorts and over time as women stay in Canada for longer periods of time. The main contributions, in my opinion, are that it's focusing on women, right? So much of the literature focused on immigration is focusing on men. And so the fact that we have a paper focusing on the main outcomes of a woman is, I think, very great. And then also looking at the quality, right? Not just these main employment or wage outcomes, but also the tasks and this resilience to automation and AI technologies. So the methodology used was mainly linear regressions and probit models. And the data was from the Labor Force Survey and the ONET. And something that was, I think, maybe not highlighted too much in the presentation was that this was specifically looking at married women, or women who are in common law relationships. And so it was focusing on women, but also this kind of subset of women for good reason. But I think that this is an important caveat to mention. And then the main results are that new immigrant women are more likely to be in bad quality jobs compared to their Canadian-born counterparts. However, there is a lot of narrowing of this gap over time as immigrant women spend more time both in Canada, but also in the labor force, which is another kind of key assumption. So a couple of things that I want to bring up and just bring to the discussion. The first is just a little bit about the framing. So I think, a main contribution of this paper was the automation and AI resilience, kind of looking at this as a topic. And I really liked because, of course, there's so many tasks we could focus on in terms of jobs. And I think that this resilience is a great one to focus on. That being said, I found in reading the paper that it could have been much more central to the introduction, the abstract. I think there's many ways we can motivate why resilience is a really important feature to think of. And that having it kind of highlighted a bit earlier in the story, I think would just kind of help people frame the paper and know that this is where we were going. And also just quantify, when we're talking about a good job or a bad job, really what measures we're going to be thinking about in this paper. The second kind of main thing that I want to bring up is just, of course, heterogeneity. So I completely understand that a lot of the kind of lack of heterogeneity or variables related to immigrants in the analysis was because of data availability. And that just a lot of variables that maybe we would want to include to kind of see how the effects would be heterogeneous compared to these variables just aren't in the data set. So that is what it is. There are some variables, though, that I think maybe could be included, such as age at immigration. I think that would be really important to see how the effects differ based on how old you were when you come in. As pointed out, there were these kind of arrival cohort dummies, which I think are doing a good job of capturing at least the level differences for these different cohorts and the compositions that these cohorts could have. However, I do think that a lot of these kind of characteristics of the cohorts could impact not just the levels, but also kind of their path over time, right? And so just thinking about how maybe we could kind of add a little bit more flexibility there, I think would be useful. And related to cohort heterogeneity, there were two other facts that I think would be hard to include in the analysis, but would be really informative to have just as context for a reader. The first is specifically kind of looking at this married woman group. So, just for external validity of the results to kind of see how much they can be extended to all immigrant women, not just married women, it would be really interesting to see, what fraction of immigrant women are married, right? Does this change over time? And then also, it was not super clear to me if the comparison group of Canadian-born women, if it was also just married women. But if it was just married women, just thinking about how preferences over marriage may have changed over the 20 years that we're looking at amongst these two different groups. And then the second one refers mainly to the kind of the main, in my opinion, assumption that's required for the validity of these results is that we're really kind of assuming that both Canadian-born women and immigrant women have the same kind of preferences on labor force participation over the course of these 20 years that we're considering them. And I really don't have any prior on what those preferences would be. And so any kind of information that I know would be hard to get that we could bring in on that, I think would be really helpful just to evaluate whether this assumption is a tough one to satisfy or if it is actually very easy. And then finally, just when reading it, there's a couple of robustness checks that I think would be very interesting to see. The first, of course, I think I've highlighted this a couple of times, is I think it would be really interesting to see the results just for all women. I think the reasons that it was restricted to married women are very good, but I was just curious to see how different the results would be if it was all women instead of just married women. I know that the geographic region of origin variable is very coarse, but I do think, again, maybe just as a robustness check, seeing the results for that would be very interesting. And then, just if there's any kind of way to incorporate further heterogeneity, especially with kind of heterogeneity in the characteristics of the immigration cohort, I think that'd be very interesting. So thank you so much for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.